Resurrection, Reason, and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. Your host, Michael, doing our second stream here. Pleased to say that we have returning guest here, Father Abbot Nicholas, also Archimandrite from Holy Resurrection Monastery over there in Wisconsin. Father Abbot, welcome back to the show. How are you?
I'm well. It's good to be back, Michael. Thank you.
It's great to have you back on, and I'm glad that our audio issues are resolved on the last time.
Yes.
Yeah, evidently on the last time we could hear each other, but others could not hear me. So thank God that that's working this time. So we'll have a little bit of a more fruitful discussion. But I am really looking forward to this. And by the way, you're also going to be back on in a few weeks to talk about spiritual direction. And I'm really looking forward to that. In fact, everybody, just to remind y'all, Father Abbott's going to be coming on the show to answer your questions about spiritual direction. And so what you'll be able to do is ask your questions here, of course, on the live chat or by way of phone calls. You'll be able to call the 800 number and ask Father Nicholas some questions there about spiritual direction. So we'll probably have about 30 minutes of a discussion on the topic and then about an hour of direction from the abbot himself. So y'all stay tuned for that. That will be happening in a couple weeks. And towards the end of the show, I'll put out the date and the time to just to remind y'all about that. But without further ado, Father Abbot Nicholas, let's go ahead and talk about the topic at hand, which is going to be synodality, the history of synodality, and also how it impacts ecumenical discussion. So take it away wherever you want to go with it.
Thank you, Michael. There's been a lot of discussion about synodality and lots of hopes, maybe some fears. Pope Francis has made a big deal about it, and there's a whole number of years really preparing and having the synods. So it's a very, very important topic. I'm going to present it from one angle, only from one angle. I believe it's the most important angle. However, other people might feel that it should go in another direction. From the beginning, the Church of Jesus Christ, the Apostolic Church, has been both primatial, you might say it, a leader, a primate, and synodal, collegial. And to get the balance of this is, I think, the challenge of the time we live in, particularly this discussion. In the early church, of course, the church was small, so it had bishops and sometimes senior bishops. And of course, because they were small, the congregations too deliberated with each other, collaborated to make decisions. As the church grew, it became increasingly difficult for everyone to be represented. And so this process of synodality came about where there were discussions, preparations, and together the conclusions of these deliberations went to the bishop. And then the bishop would make up his mind. However, if it involved many bishops, many dioceses, then the bishops together would meet with the metropolitan, the senior bishop of the province, and he would pull together what they brought to the synod, to the council, and he would make a decision. And then this went a step further as the church grew, particularly when it became established as the religion of the Roman Empire. It went to a lot more senior bishops, sometimes patriarchs, and in the case of the West, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. And the patriarchs representing their churches, or the Bishop of Rome representing his church, came together in council, usually called by the emperor, the Roman emperor. And of course, the Roman emperor from very early on, from pre-Christian times, had also a religious role. His role wasn't purely secular. He had a religious role. He wasn't a bishop, but he definitely had a religious role. Of course, in paganism, he was a god, while with Christianity, with the baptism of the Roman Empire in Byzantium, the emperor could no longer be God, but he certainly had divine right. He certainly had divine prerogatives. And one of those was to call a council of all the bishops in the church so that they could represent their own people and make decisions in council or in synod. That's how it worked for a long time. In the West, it began to change when the Western Roman Empire was kind of in its last legs, politically, culturally, from about the 500s-600s. And so the imperial authority in the West was pretty non-existent. This was the period of lots of wars and feudalism and these northern tribes that came in to take the Western Roman Empire. So in a vacuum where there wasn't an empire and there wasn't, for all intents and purposes, an emperor, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, as the only remaining institution that was able to function, took on a lot of the prerogatives of the Roman emperor. And one of those prerogatives was to call an ecumenical council. That was fine in the West. In the East, of course, that didn't happen. In the Eastern Roman Empire, it stayed intact for another 1,000 years. There continued to be an emperor. And so the Patriarch of Constantinople, New Rome, the Bishop of New Rome, did not have those prerogatives. They were still the prerogatives of the emperor, called the council. The Patriarch had a very kind of important role in kind of symphony with that, church and state. And he often was very influential, but he didn't actually call the councils. It was the emperor that will call the councils, just as it had been in the beginning. And these are really the two main differences, the two really significant differences between the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is based on a primacy of the Bishop of Rome that culturally and politically kind of came in some ways in practical terms from the emperor. So the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, the senior bishop, is the central authority in the church, at least the Western Church, and he has the right to call an ecumenical council and make decisions pertaining to the whole church. In the East, that didn't happen because there was an emperor, so it remained much more a synodal church, a kind of a church of confederation of local churches. And they came together in council when the emperor called them in council or a synod, and then they made a decision. This is really, it's a matter of ecclesiology, of church governance, and it's really doctrinally amongst serious Catholic and Orthodox theologians, really the only divide between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. That's really where the division occurs. It continued to get progressively more in the direction in the West with the rise of modern nations. The emphasis started to get more and more and heavily on the Pope as the universal pastor, so that he could keep some sort of unity, at least in the church, that now belonged to different nations. The church wasn't politically as monolithic anymore, so it became theologically more monolithic. In the East, the opposite happened with the eventual fall of the Eastern Roman Empire in the East. Then nations began to develop there too, and in those cases, the churches didn't have a pope, so they were pretty much founded on as national churches, more or less, except the ancient patriarchs of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. And so I would say that after the 16th century, in the West, the Catholic Church, the Church in the West, became more and more centralized under Rome, and the Eastern churches became more and more decentralized as national churches. And there are advantages and disadvantages, challenges with both those systems. I believe the future, and this is why I believe this talk on synodality is so important, the indirect aim, of course, is to unite the Catholic and Orthodox churches, to unite the apostolic churches that go back to the early church. And probably in practice, what's going to have to happen is the Orthodox churches are going to have to become a little bit more dependent on the universal primacy, the primate of Rome, because there's no longer a Western emperor or an Eastern Roman emperor, so it has to be the Pope. But the Western Church will have to realize that it can't be exercised as juridically based on so much centrality as it has. I mean, the epitome of that really happened at Vatican I. If you're going to bring the Orthodox on board, they're never going to accept that kind of centrality because primacy, because they're going to say, well, that's only 100 years old. That doesn't go back to the beginning. So I see the Synod of Bishops in Rome, if it goes well, dealing with a very, very important issue of universal church governance, which the whole apostolic churches, Catholic and Orthodox, can work together and address the enormous challenges we have before us. We can only meet these challenges if we work together. We can only work together if we have some sort of government based on apostolic tradition that enables us to pool our resources and make decisions together. The Orthodox realize that they are too decentralized. Many Orthodox say, we need a pope. We just don't need a pope exercising his authority as the way he has been since Vatican I. So, a lot of Orthodox, a lot of, very scholarly Orthodox positions recognize that this lack of primacy on the universal level is not doable. A present example, of course, is the tensions between the Moscow Patriarchate and the Patriarchate of Constantinople as we speak. There needs to be a universal primate to be able to resolve that. However, does a universal primate, this is what the Orthodox would ask, does a universal primate means that basically the Bishop of Rome is really the only real bishop and the rest are just his assistants throughout the world, that everything comes from Rome and he can make decisions over and above any other bishop throughout the whole church. It's called immediate jurisdiction, universal immediate jurisdiction. They would not accept that is the apostolic view of the primacy of the Bishop of Rome. I think they would accept that the Bishop of Rome would be the only legitimate one that could call a council. I hope, because someone has to, and I don't think Christian emperors in the East or the West are going to come back anytime soon. So in that vacuum, the Bishop of Rome is really the only one that has in some way that prerogative. But how that is exercised and how much the way the Eastern Church developed in government will also have to be, allowances will have to be made for that.
Do you feel that this then means that there needs to be a healthy decentralization in Latin ecclesiology, especially?
Correct. Yes. And the thing I emphasize, based on the apostolic tradition of the church, not based on some sort of secular democracy model. That's not, Pope Francis made it clear, that's not what is being talked about. It has to be based on the apostolic tradition of the church that is shared both in East and West, particularly in the first millennium, how that can be reworked so that it is acceptable to both East and West together to function as a church and meet the challenges of the future of the 21st century.
Do you think that there's some who are trying to co-opt the talk of Pope Francis on synodality for a malevolent purpose? They're trying to use it for something, like you said, to promote more of a democratic view and not the ancient understanding of synodality. Do you think?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And that's a great fear I have, because I think in some ways, even Vatican II sometimes was hijacked to be interpreted in that way. And I do not believe that's the way the Church, the Vatican II fathers saw it. And I think it's very important that we mustn't be naive that in the world of mass media, we see it in the synodal process in Germany. There are great risks involved. And the Orthodox have been very keen to tell the Catholic Church that they've been at the synodality for a long time, and they want to bend over backwards to give advice of what to do and what not to do. And I think we should take that advice very seriously. They need to be our collaborators. We need to start working synodally already, even before we've written it down on paper. And I'm glad to see that on all levels, Orthodox bishops are going to be represented and have their share in the discussion, because that's something that the way they functioned from the beginning. They haven't put the emphasis on primacy, universal primacy that the West has in its own form of government.
Have they been consulted so far? I mean, you're talking about they're going to be consulted. Has that happened to date, especially the Eastern Orthodox here?
Yes, I think it has. I know, and certainly the appeal. In fact, a lot of the theologians that would write about synodality, really since Vatican II, and even before, have extensively used Orthodox perspectives and what synodality is. So it's already in the mix of the theological discussion, absolutely.
And what about Eastern Catholics? Are they playing a role right now in this discussion of synodality?
Well, I think the role we small Eastern Catholics, is precisely to show that it's not easy and it hasn't been done yet, but that East and West are really one church at the deepest level. And therefore, to pretend that it's not is not reality. The apostolic faith, whether we like it or not, has come down to us in an Eastern form and a Western form. And we have to work towards recognizing that and working within that framework if we are going to work together. That's just the reality. If we claim apostolic tradition, we can't accept one model or the other, because for 1,000 years, and even before that, when the church was still in communion, the universal governance was still different from in East and West, even when it wasn't seen as a reason to break communion. Mm-hmm. So I think it's the only way to go if we are going to unite, and if we're going to survive as Christianity, we're going to have to unite. Mm. Now, not just politically, but in faith.
Mm. It kind of sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but ecclesiologically, the Catholic Church needs the Orthodox, and the Orthodox need Catholics.
Absolutely, what Pope John Paul used, the phrase he used often, although it didn't originate with him, of the two lungs of the church. And some theologians are now saying 3 lungs of the church, because the Syriac tradition, the tradition that was outside the Roman Empire, is part of that. But for all intents and purposes these days, unfortunately, the Syriac tradition, the Oriental tradition, the tradition outside the Roman Empire, unfortunately, although 1,000 years ago it was the majority of the church, the numbers are much smaller in the time we live in. And so the big churches with majorities are the Eastern European and Western European.
Is that partly due to persecution?
Yes, from Islam.
Yeah, it's terrible. Well, so let's talk a little bit more about synodality presently, today. This idea of a synod on synods. Well, so there's, as at least the way that I understand it, there's going to be a group of bishops who advise the Pope in Rome, and this is considered to be a synod. Is that concept a little distinct from synodality as it's understood in the East, where it's more a group of bishops, not necessarily advising a primate, but a group of bishops getting together in a particular territory and making decisions for that territory? So, in other words, are there differences between what Pope Francis has called a synod and the way Orthodox understand synodality?
That's a good question. And of course, after 1,000 years of developing different forms of government, of course, this is something that they're going to have to discuss. Both the Eastern bishops and the Western bishops might be doing that, interpreting in that way, sometimes without even being aware of it. After 1,000 years, of course, that's going to be one of the things that's going to have to be nutted out and discussed.
So when we look at, for example, national conferences in the Catholic Church, we've had that, especially in the post-conciliar era. How are those maybe a little different from this concept of synodality as we see in the East? Is there a difference?
Oh, there's I believe there's a huge difference. The main difference is that at least canonically, the Episcopal conferences don't have any deep canonical status. I mean, it's very clear that the people that have the status of the bishops and the Bishop of Rome, there's no other body that's an executive body in the canonical sense. A synod would be, or a council, or even a plenary council, but it still has to be it has to still be approved by the Holy See for it to be able to legislate.
It seems like even in our history with the Catholic Church, there used to be regional synods and national synods. That used to happen a lot more often in our history, and you pretty much don't see that today. So do you think that this is maybe putting us in the direction so that we can go back to that?
Yes, as I say, the church became more and more centralized, even in the West, gradually. And it really got sped up in the past 100 years. The country that I spend most of my upbringing in was Australia, and they're going through a plenary council at the moment, actually. First one in a long time. And so, yes, I think we can look at those models to see that it's not completely new even in the West, but also more importantly in the Eastern Orthodox Church, where it is more a part of normal government in the church, and therefore we have a lot to learn, and they have something to learn too, and the best of them would acknowledge that, as I say, because what do you do when there's no Byzantine emperor who calls the council? This is a real problem in the Eastern Church, in Eastern Orthodox churches.
You mentioned the issue right now taking place between Moscow and Constantinople, and also Alexandria. So would you say that synodality, as good as it is, it still needs a first, it still needs a primate in the way that Catholics understand it? Because of course Orthodox are going to say there's a sense in which the Patriarch of Constantinople is the first, but in a very different way in which we understand in the Catholic Church.
Yes, and in the way they understand it, that I don't think there are too many Orthodox that would see the Patriarch of Constantinople having a primacy like the Bishop of Rome, because they know that there's no precedence for that. But a lot of them, though, would object that the primary, I mean, a lot of them would accept in a future church, the Orthodox would have to accept the primacy of the Bishop of Rome because it was accepted in the first millennium. But what does that mean? That's the nub. So it's not a matter of, the primacy of the Patriarch of New Rome or Old Rome. That's not really the issue. The issue is, no, the whole church is in some way dependent on the primacy, the universal church of the Bishop of Rome. No other bishop has that kind of standing and precedent in history. But the problem comes is what that primacy is. What, is it just a last court of appeal? Is it an immediate and universal jurisdiction where the Pope can just go in to, the Solomon Islands and remove a bishop and put a new bishop in, for example? Or Germany, he can just go in and take out the Bishop of Munich and put another bishop in. The Orthodox would not see that as what the primacy of the Pope involves.
How have the Orthodox reacted so far to this discussion in the Catholic Church about synodality? Has there been an Orthodox response?
Well, I think it depends. Lay people don't, of course, like a lot of Catholics, aren't very informed, and they don't really. But amongst theologians, and I think bishops, particularly the more theologically minded bishops, and I think there's a lot of excitement and hope.
What are some additional benefits that you might foresee, or that you foresee might come about from this adoption of synodality? We've discussed a few so far. Are there any others that might benefit the Catholic Church adopting more of a synodal process?
Well, I think because if you don't put the papacy in context, you can have a problem of not enough papal primacy, and that the Orthodox sometimes suffer from that. But I think you can go to the opposite extreme of having papal overreach. And I think even in the Catholic Church, even amongst some quarters that you would least expect it, are beginning to talk about that now. Just how much power does the Pope have within the tradition of the Church? Does he have the right to alter tradition? Who interprets what is tradition and what is not tradition? These are questions that are important questions. So I think that's an important issue that has to be discussed. On the one extreme, you get no primacy from the Bishop of Rome. On the other extreme, you get primatial overreach. And both are not the apostolic faith of the Church. I think hopefully both Catholic and Orthodox would accept that. Now, where the line is, the balance is, that's the challenge we have.
I think you're right there. That's the key question, and I think really that's what continues to divide East and West, unfortunately, is that very question. So that if we can solve really that question,
deep down, it's really the only. The rest of issues, sometimes non very theologically literate Catholics understand that, but that's really the only divide between the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. Church government at the highest level, like universal church governance.
When you spoke about overage there, when it comes to the papacy, do you think that maybe the Pope appointing bishops in a territory, or at least granting the approval of a bishop in a particular territory, is reminiscent of an overage, or do you think that that's something healthy in the Catholic Church?
Oh, well, historically, it's certainly an overreach. I mean, it's very recent, extremely recent. For the Pope to have that kind of authority. Very recent. Well, 100 years ago, there wasn't communications like there is now, so it
Mhm.
wouldn't have even been possible.
Mhm.
It just, that was reality, So that's a very, very recent
Mhm.
practical way of appointing bishops.
Mhm. Have you seen anything that would indicate that maybe Rome is starting to let up on some of these things that when it comes to overage, in addition to adopting this talk on synodality? Have you seen any other things that kind of shows that Rome's going in that direction?
Um, well, I think they know that there's a problem, and I think the reaching out to the Orthodox is something very tenable.
Mm.
How deep it is amongst how many theologians and bishops, I don't know. There certainly is, from a lot of them, but the Orthodox, the dialogue, the outreach to the Orthodox Church on the side of the Catholic Church, I think is pretty genuine and pretty authentic and pretty vibrant, at least externally. Now,
Mhm.
when it comes to the nitty gritty, that remains to be seen.
Do you think if the Catholic Church adopts this perspective on synodality and begins to practice it, that will be enough for there to be reunion between Catholics and Orthodox, or do you think that maybe other issues would still remain and need to be hashed out?
No, I don't think other issues are fairly minor. I think they would be overcome fairly quickly, other issues. But that issue is so important that it needs to be discussed and a position come to,
Mhm.
and probably a period of reception too on the part
Mm.
of both churches. It's a long process. It's not going to be a magic wand solution. That's just not going to happen. Magic might exist in storybooks, but in reality, that's not how it works.
You bring up reception there. What role does reception really play when it comes to a synodal understanding of government of the church?
Um, that's an interesting topic, and even amongst the Orthodox, there's different views in different jurisdictions, like the Russian understanding of reception and the Greek understanding of reception is slightly different. So there are varieties of approaches um,
Mhm.
in the Catholic Church. Even there it exists, but in the Catholic Church it's much more legislative, right? The Pope has signed it, it's happened. But in practice, we all know that even in the Catholic Church, reality doesn't happen that way just because you've signed the document. I think some bishops were kind of overtaken by some of the liturgical reactions
Mm.
in the Western Church since Vatican II, and how they thought they had dealt with them. And now, 50 years later, the same fights are started up again, the
Yeah.
liturgical wars. Uh, just because you sign something or something on paper might look good, but reception of something is not always that easy or that simple.
That's very true. So what happens if a synod of bishops adopts a position that is not traditional? What should happen at that point, given a synodal government of the church?
Well, of course, synod occurs on all levels.
Mm.
And on the highest level, of course, it's an ecumenical council,
Mhm.
which would have to be approved by, well, eventually the papacy.
Mhm.
It would have to be for it to be a church council.
So an ecumenical council would need to correct perhaps an
Correct.
erring synod.
Correct. Correct.
Mhm.
Something
Well,
something lower down the hierarchy of decision making, collegiality. Yes.
what if the Pope just kind of top down corrects the synod? Do you think that that's helpful or should be done?
Um, well, in Catholic ecclesiology present, the Pope does have that power. What power the Pope has compared to an ecumenical council, not a synod, ecumenical council, that's a little bit more contentious.
Mm-hmm.
Can he override a council? That's a little bit more contentious.
And I meant a pope overriding a local synod that kind of goes astray and adopts a position.
Correct. That's I mean, that has happened in church history all the time. A pope, and sometimes not even a pope, a patriarch in his own territory can override a synod because a synod is local.
Like a local group of bishops get together, the patriarch.
Yeah. Or for example, a province in a national church, a province might even have a synod. Even a diocese might have a synod. But say a province of bishops, yes, even a province, the metropolitan and his bishops can be overridden by the patriarch, which is the whole patriarchal church.
So now we're kind of talking about synodality involving multiple levels. What role do the laity play when it comes to these synods?
Well, they're one of the levels. They're the most basic level. We govern the church in faith, which we receive through baptism. So every baptized Christian must be baptized. Every baptized Christian, with baptism rightly understood, has a voice in governing the church. Now, but that, of course, goes through a process. That doesn't mean their voice is as big as the Pope's voice, because the Pope isn't speaking for himself. He's speaking for the whole process of synodality that comes to a conclusion. When a person speaks, he's speaking just for himself as an individual, for their own personal salvation, their own soul. But when the Pope speaks, that's not what he's doing, or even a bishop. When a bishop speaks, he's speaking for his diocese, not just for himself. And so the laity absolutely have a voice, but it's their voice. It's for them. It's not representing officially any organ of the church.
Do you think that laity should be present at these synods and have a participating role, or should their participation be kind of like a questionnaire sent out to individuals and they submit that feedback to the bishop? How do you think it should be done?
Well, there are diverse models. There have been historically, and there still are. I mean, the emperor was kind of a layman, and he called the councils. Well, was he a layman and was he not a layman? That's tricky. In theology, that's tricky. But certainly in modern history, a head of a government would be a secular, would be a layperson, okay, by virtue of being head of state. And so does that mean that the head of state doesn't have political clout, even in church matters? Or you and I know that of course they do. I mean, look at, one of the very sensitive issues at the moment in the Orthodox Church is the role that Putin plays in the Moscow Patriarchate, and therefore in Orthodoxy. It's a very difficult, complex. I don't believe it's nuanced enough when people talk about that, because it's a real complexity.
We're going to get to some live chat questions here in just a moment. Y'all go ahead and start putting them in the comment section, please. Make sure to send them to @ReasonandTheology so I can differentiate them from the comments. But Father Abbot, let me ask you this. What are some other things that, as we begin to explore synodality in the Catholic Church, what are some other things that we should be cautious of?
I think the main thing, and I know the Orthodox churches warned the Catholic Church at the promulgation of the Second Vatican Council that they needed to be a little bit more focused. It shouldn't just be an open for all. I mean, it can at some levels, sure, so that everyone can have a say, but it has to be maneuvered, guided in a very wise and prudent way, navigated in a way that it just won't be everything all at the same time, and then everyone loses control and they don't know where it's going. That is something the Orthodox, I think, would warn the Catholic Church to be aware of that, and they know from their own experiences that can happen.
So somewhat kind of limiting the discussions that are going to take place. Is that effectively it?
At the bottom level, they can be pretty open because
Right.
input is important, but there has to be an understanding that gradually, that has to be honed down. If it's going to be a real decision, if real decisions are going to be made.
What's the biggest thing that you think should be discussed right now with a synodal model? Obviously, we're having a synod on synodality. So aside from synodality itself, what do you think should be discussed?
Well, of course, it's the unity, the communion of the Catholic and Orthodox churches. That's really where the rubber hits the road. That's really what's going to help us meet the challenges of the 21st century.
There are a couple questions here. So one is, what would the papacy look like if we reunited with the Eastern Orthodox?
In my view, this is just we don't know, of course. That's the $1 million question. We don't know. But in my view, it would have to be less exercising less a sovereign primatial role. So it would have to be more accountable to a church council and to church synods.
What is
less papal overreach?
Yeah,
To be aware of, much more guarded about papal overreach and the real possibility that it can happen.
This one looks interesting. What is your advice for the one thing you would advise lay people to do to help the cause of reunification?
Prayer, most of all, because it's a spiritual journey, it's a spiritual quest. But after prayer, to become informed, to read up on these things, so that even lay people can make a great contribution if they're educated. Sometimes clerics are abysmally ignorant of some of these issues. A layperson can be as informed as a cleric. And so most of all prayer, what I would call the spiritual level, but then the intellectual level, to be informed, to know what you're talking about, not just to be, like the media go and they do these polls, they take these polls and they just get anyone from the street and what do you think of this? Well, who cares what they think of that?
Right.
If you're serious, you're talking about something specific. You wouldn't stop anyone in the street and ask them how to go about taking care of a disease in the world. You go to the experts first. It doesn't matter what they think if it's just their opinion.
I agree. To what extent is a synod binding on the church?
This synod, the one that's going to, you mean the Synod of Bishops? The Synod of Bishops, in the present canonical understanding of the Catholic Church, it's not a church council, so there's no there is no question of it overriding the authority of the Pope. It's not a church council.
On a social level, what do you think would be the most noticeable difference after reunion?
On the social level,
On the social level, would there be any differences that are noticeable with the reunion with the Orthodox?
well, I think there would be more freedom locally for the churches to, as long as they didn't transgress doctrinal boundaries and serious boundaries. I think there could be a lot more diversity, and rather than uniformity. And there has been in the church always, usually mainly because, as I say, with lack of communication, they didn't have a choice. But I think it was a healthy thing as well. It can go too far, and I know that Trent, the Council of Trent, with Protestantism, was concerned to start greater control and impose greater uniformity because there were real threats of heresy if you left the gate too far open. But now that's 400 years later, there's over 1 billion people in the Catholic Church. I just don't know how that imposition of uniformity can work anymore in any meaningful way. Uniformity has to exist, of course, in dogma, in the basics. And sometimes that's a good question. Where does the demarcation line between big T tradition and small T tradition occur? It's not as easy as one would think to find that line. Where do you cross that line? It's a hotly debated issue in the Catholic Church with a lot of the liturgical reforms, as you well know. It's not an easy question to answer. It's a complex question.
We have another question here, but I'll give a little bit of background because they're asking, what do you think about some of the behavior and the discussions that we see online? Just to give you an idea, there are a lot of Catholic and Orthodox discussions that take place online that are very, very what's the word I'm looking for, but negative. Each person views the other in the worst possible terms, interprets them in the worst possible ways, people calling each other heretics and saying you're going to hell. There's a lot of those discussions taking place between online Catholics and online Orthodox, not necessarily saying in reality, but online. What are your thoughts there?
Unfortunately, the human reality is that those that they have a very high opinion of their views are usually the ones that participate in those fora. And so they're the ones you hear because they have the biggest axe to grind. Right. But they should be the ones that least influence sensible discussion.
That's true. Yeah, right now they have the loudest voice. All right, so what would you do, or what should we do if there's a majority of the laity who aren't Orthodox in their understanding of the faith and use synodality to push their agenda?
I think, well, that would be a good question to ask the Orthodox who have been at it a lot longer than Catholics have. But I suspect the Orthodox will say, well, this is not open for all. This has to be according to the tradition of the church. So basically, and the bishops ultimately have to decide, but they don't just decide according to their own preferences or even according to their own education, or they have to decide according to what has always been believed and taught, what is the tradition of the church. Now, sometimes that can become contentious, but one has to ask that question. I know with respect to the liturgical reforms of the Second Vatican Council in the Western Church, this is an issue. Some people are saying, well, the Novus Ordo has broken with tradition. It's just too new, too radical a change. And other people say, well, no, it's not. It is in accordance with tradition. That's not an easy question to answer. That's a complex, and I think there needs to be humility on both sides and great wisdom and great holiness. So prayer needs to be a big part of that. I don't have a simple answer, but it is an important question. We have to be serious about this. It's about our salvation is at stake. It's not something we can treat lightly or just in the way that we would treat other social or political decisions. It's not just that. It's about salvation. It's something very deep, and we shouldn't be flippant how we decide and how we listen to the decisions that have been made.
Is a synod the same thing as a pastoral council, or are there differences?
Canonically, canonically it's completely different, but I think in its there are a lot of similarities, and the similarities, of course, are mainly great collaboration, for decisions made in the church to be more collaborative. However, they need to be collaborative on all levels. Sometimes, I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, but sometimes what I call the professional laity are very quick to tell the hierarchical church where the church should be going. But they're not always representative of the vast majority of the laity. They're the professional. They're kind of pseudo-clerics, basically. It's a pseudo-clericalism. I know Pope Francis speaks about that too, and he's very down on that. That's not what he means by the church being less clerical, just a new form of lay clericalism. So there are great challenges.
One more question. We have somebody who's asking, what is the icon behind you?
The icon is the icon of the Transfiguration. Oh no, this is the risen Christ. It's got the four evangelists, and it's Christ reigning in glory, and he's holding, of course, the book of the Gospels, basically. It's there are many forms of it, but it's basically Christ, the Pantocrator, the above creation. Often a form of this, not exactly the same, but a form of this is often in the dome of the church, which is the highest physical part of the church, where Christ is, and he looks upon everything else from that vantage point.
In the middle of the nave.
It's the highest geographical location. So I'm not an iconographer, so I can't give about the history of that particular icon. But so I'll leave that to others. But that's basically what it is. It's Christ, the Christ God, basically.
Father Abbot, we're going to have you back on the 22nd, and we're going to have you on that evening again to discuss spiritual direction, about 30 minutes of that, and then an hour of actual spiritual direction. So viewers, listeners, if you want guidance, spiritual guidance from an abbot, definitely join us then. Again, that's
I will make one condition on that. They have to pray about it before they bring it up.
Excellent.
Okay.
Excellent. And so if you decide to come, you'll be able to ask questions on the live chat, so you can type your questions and also call in. I'm still deliberating on whether or not we would have video capabilities. Probably not. We'll just do phone or text. That seems to work best. It's a little more difficult getting video capabilities for guest questioners, so we'll probably just leave it to voice and text. So y'all look forward to that. Father Abbot, could you tell us a little bit about your monastery for those who might not be familiar with it?
Our monastery was founded in 1995, very recently. It's really a call that Pope John Paul II made, Saint Pope John Paul II made in a document called Orientale Lumen, in which he encouraged Western Christians to become more associated with and more educated about Eastern Christians, including Eastern Catholics. And so our monastery was an attempt to live Eastern Catholic monastic life more authentically, as the Orthodox churches have done from the beginning. We, because we're small, have sometimes been influenced by the West for all sorts of reasons, to present, to unapologetically be Catholic in faith, but also, apart from the essentials, to be Orthodox. Now, what are the essentials? In my view, the essentials are the position of the Bishop of Rome. I accept the position of the primacy of the Bishop of Rome in the Universal Church. Apart from that, I can be completely like the Orthodox. And that's what our monastery strives to do, to be. It's the Bishop of Rome that has encouraged us to establish these monasteries. And so we're only doing what he's asked us to do, to be obedient to the Bishop of Rome, but in every other respect to be like the Orthodox Church, because that's what he's asked us to do. Now, some Orthodox will say that's impossible. Well, I guess it's an experiment at this stage.
And Father Abbot, put in a plug for anything else that you want the viewers and listeners to be aware of.
Yes, familiarize yourself with the tradition of the church, particularly the Eastern tradition, both the Byzantine and the Oriental, the other people. Read, listen to podcasts. There's a lot of good stuff out there. Go to the services. If they're Eastern Catholic, and you normally would receive communion in the Catholic Church, you're allowed to receive communion. If you go to an Orthodox, normally they don't invite you to communion. Sometimes it depends, but you can still go, you can still pray, you can still participate, you can still be part of, after all, we are the same church. Deep down, the Catholic Church certainly believes that. The Catholic Church accepts the Eucharist in the Orthodox Church as the Eucharist. Therefore, we are part of the same church. Canonically, there might be slight differences with respect to church government, but hey, if the Orthodox have the Eucharist, they are members of the same church that I'm a member of.
Well said, and may we have your blessing too.
Absolutely. And again, one request, that you pray for us, that you pray for this little tiny new monastery in Wisconsin that's attempting to fulfill a great charism in the church. And may Almighty God bless you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. God bless everyone.
Thank you so much, Father Abbot. We'll have you on in just a few weeks. And everybody, thank y'all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And also check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology, if you want to support what we're doing here. We'll see y'all later. God bless.